He controlled the silence. That was the thing people never understood about Nae Chung-Ae. It wasn't the fear he commanded, or the empire he ran, or the way grown men stopped breathing when he entered a room. It was the silence. His grandfather's estate sat on the edge of Seoul like a sleeping king, walled, guarded, untouchable. 42 rooms, 18 staff, one rule that governed them all. Nothing happened inside these walls without his knowledge. Nothing. So when the sound reached him, a sharp, crystalline crash, followed by something wet and desperate that no man should ever make with his throat, Chung-Ae didn't run. He went completely, dangerously still. His white shirt hung open at the chest. The dark ink of his tattoos, wings that had never meant freedom, only war disappeared into the shadow of the corridor as he moved, not running, stalking. The way a predator moves when it already knows something is wrong, and the only question left is who dies for it. He pushed open the dining room door, and the silence he controlled shattered forever. His grandfather, the man who had built everything, who had survived decades of blood and betrayal, who Chung-Ae had privately believed was too stubborn to die, was on the floor, gray suit, gray hair, both hands clawing at his own throat like he was trying to pull something invisible from inside it. The heavy dining table loomed over him like a tombstone. A crystal glass lay on its side on the antique rug, a milky puddle spreading slow and quiet into the fibers. And kneeling over him, a woman, black, young, wearing a chef's white double-breasted coat, dark pants, hands moving with terrifying purpose over the old man's chest and throat. Her eyes were wide, not with guilt, not with the look of someone caught, but with the raw, electric urgency of someone trying to hold death back with bare hands. She looked up when he entered, and she did not flinch. "Don't touch him yet," she said. Her voice was steady in a way her eyes were not. "I know what this is. Give me 90 seconds. Chung-Ae's hand found his weapon before his mind caught up. 90 seconds. The woman who had been hired 3 weeks ago to manage his grandfather's diet, the American, the chef, the stranger, was kneeling in a room that smelled faintly of something chemical and wrong, with a dying patriarch in her arms, asking him for 90 seconds. Every instinct he owned was screaming, but his grandfather was still breathing. Barely. He stepped into the room. He did not lower the gun, but he did not pull the trigger. Not yet. Because here is what nobody tells you about a man like Nae Chung-Ae, a man who controls silence, who rules with iron and ice, who has never in his life trusted anyone who did not share his blood. The moment you realize your blood may have done this to you, everything you thought you knew becomes a weapon pointed at your own chest. He watched her hands move, certain, precise, like she'd trained for a catastrophe nobody else saw coming. He watched his grandfather's face pale, contorted, agonized, and then, fractionally begin to ease. 90 seconds. Chung-Ae lowered the gun exactly 1 inch. "Who are you?" he said quietly. "And how do you know what poison this is?" She looked up at him again, eyes wide, terrified, but her hands never stopped moving. "Because I know what was in that glass, and whoever put it there knew your grandfather's chemistry better than I do, which means it wasn't me." The estate had 42 rooms. Before dawn, every single one of them would become a trap. Before we start, go ahead and subscribe, like, and share where you're watching from. It always warms my heart to see our little storytelling family stretch across the world. Every click, every comment, every bit of love you give helps us keep uncovering these unforgettable stories together. So find your quiet place, settle in, and let me take you somewhere you've never been before. He gave her the 90 seconds. He counted every one of them. Chung-Ae stood in the doorway of the dining room with the gun level and his jaw locked so tight he could feel his back teeth grinding against each other, and he watched Cheryl Sletton work. She wasn't panicking. That was the thing that kept his finger off the trigger, not her words, not her explanation, not the wide terror in her eyes when she looked up at him. It was the fact that her hands weren't panicking. They moved the way hands move when they've rehearsed something so many times that the body stops waiting for the brain. She had 2 fingers pressed against the underside of his grandfather's jaw, tracking the pulse. Her other hand was already unbuttoning the top of the old man's collar, loosening the silk tie, giving the throat room to work. "He's still absorbing it," she said, not to Chung-Ae, almost to herself. "We have a window. Small, but it's there." "A window for what?" His voice came out flat. That was how he sounded when the rage was at its worst. Not loud, not explosive, but compressed, pressurized, like something structural about to give. "For me to get to the kitchen." She looked up at him again. "I need activated charcoal. I need whole milk. I need the largest pot you have, and I need it in the next 4 minutes or none of this matters." He stared at her. "You walk me to that kitchen yourself," she said. "You put the gun on the back of my neck the entire way. But you walk me there, because I am the only person in this building who knows what compound is in that glass. And if we don't bind it to something and get it out of his system, your grandfather dies on this rug in the next 20 minutes. The silence stretched between them like a wire pulled to its absolute limit. Chung-Ae looked at his grandfather. The old man's hands had stopped clawing quite so desperately at his throat, but his color was wrong, that particular wrong that Chung-Ae had seen before. In rooms he didn't like to remember the gray-white of a body, beginning its quiet negotiation with shutdown. He crossed the room in 4 strides. He did not put the gun away. He grabbed Cheryl by the back of the chef's coat and hauled her upright and said, very quietly, into the side of her head, "If he dies, you die. Do you understand me?" "Then let's make sure neither of those things happen," she said, and she moved. He had to nearly match her pace to keep the gun where he wanted it. The kitchen was at the far end of the east corridor, an industrial space, all stainless steel and hanging copper, enormous and cold and smelling of the dinner service that had ended 2 hours ago. Cheryl went straight for the pantry like she'd been born knowing where it was. He followed her in, gun up, watching her hands the entire time. She pulled down a sealed black container from the back of the top shelf. Then she went to the refrigerator, pulled out a full 2-liter of whole milk. She grabbed a wide-mouthed pitcher, a long-handled stirring spoon, and a clean cheesecloth from the prep station. "Activated charcoal is a binding agent," she said, talking while she worked, talking the way people talk when they need you to understand exactly what they're doing so you don't shoot them. "It adsorbs the toxin, not absorbs, adsorbs, meaning it pulls it to the surface and traps it before the intestinal lining can keep processing it into the bloodstream. The milk slows the gastric emptying. Together they buy us time and reduce the concentration of whatever reached his blood already." "You're a chef," Chung-Ae said. "I'm a chef with a background in food science and chemical interactions." She was mixing now, the black powder turning the milk into something that looked deeply wrong. Her movements measured and deliberate. "Do you know how similar cooking chemistry is to toxicology? Heat, pH, binding agents, catalysts? I've spent 15 years understanding exactly what certain compounds do to the human body." She looked at him over her shoulder. "Which is also exactly why I would never use that knowledge to hurt an old man who was kind to me. He hired you 3 weeks ago. He said please when he asked me to adjust the salt in his congee." She stoppered the pitcher. "Most people don't say please to their staff." "I noticed." She picked up the pitcher and turned around. "Now I need to get this into him, and I need you to help me keep him conscious enough to swallow." They went back together, Chung-Ae's hand still on the back of her collar, moving fast through the corridor. 2 of his men appeared from the east entrance, big men, hands already reaching, and Chung-Ae said, without breaking stride, "With me," and they fell into formation without a word. His grandfather was still on the floor, still breathing. The sound of it was terrible, a labored, mucus drag that filled the beautiful room like something that didn't belong there. Cheryl knelt beside him immediately and tilted his head, one hand supporting the base of his skull with a practiced gentleness that had no business existing in a room with 3 armed men standing over her. "Grandfather." She kept her voice low and steady. "I need you to swallow for me. Can you do that?" The old man's eyes moved, found her face. Something passed between them, something Chung-Ae filed away and did not understand yet. She got 3 swallows into him, then a 4th. Then she sat back on her heels and pressed 2 fingers to his wrist and closed her eyes for exactly 5 seconds. When she opened them, she said, "Okay, he's not getting worse." Chung-Ae crouched down across from her, his grandfather between them like a border neither of them could cross. He looked at the old man's face, at the color, which was still wrong but no longer moving in the wrong direction. At the hands, which had dropped from the throat and were resting now, trembling slightly, on the rug. He looked at the spilled crystal glass, at the milky puddle, still wet and spreading. Then he looked at Cheryl, at her eyes which were already looking back at him, at her hands which had stopped moving and were resting open on her knees, palms up, in a posture that was either unconscious or deliberate, and either way communicated something he wasn't ready to name. He stood up. "Lock it down," he said. His men were already moving before he finished the sentence. The estate had 12 exterior doors, not counting the service entrances, and Chung-Ae knew the location of every single one of them. Within 6 minutes of his order, every door was sealed, and every guard was at a post. The gates at the main entrance went to manual override, no electronic signal in or out. He had 3 men physically cutting the telephone lines to the estate's landline system before he remembered that no one used landlines anymore. And then he had those same 3 men collecting every mobile phone from every member of staff and locking them in the study. 41 people were on the estate that night. Staff, guards, kitchen crew, household. One of them had just tried to murder the most important person in Nae Chung-Ae's life. One of them was still inside these walls. He had Cheryl brought to the study first. She came in still wearing the chef's coat, which now had a faint smear of charcoal along the left cuff. She sat down in the chair across from his desk without being told to and folded her hands in her lap and looked at him with the expression of a woman who understood exactly what this room was and had decided that the only option available to her was to be completely, exhaustively honest. He appreciated that. He did not tell her so. "Walk me through tonight," he said. "From the beginning. Every minute you were in contact with my grandfather." "Dinner service ended at 9:15, she said. "The patriarch ate in the dining room alone as he does on Tuesdays. I served the meal myself because the senior kitchen staff had been released for the evening per his request. He had the braised short rib with the reduced ginger broth, steamed bok choy, and rice. Everything I prepared fresh today, everything sourced this morning, nothing that left my sight between prep and plate. And after dinner. He asked me to stay and have tea with him. He does that sometimes." Something moved across her face, not guilt, but grief. The real kind. The kind that arrives before you've given yourself permission to feel it. We talked for maybe 30 minutes. About food, mostly. He was asking me about Nigerian spice trade routes. He was curious about everything. She paused. Around 9:50, he asked for a glass of water. I went to the kitchen to check on the cleaning crew. He poured the water himself or someone poured it for him. I wasn't in the room. Chung-Ae was very still. "When I came back," she said, "he was already holding the glass. He took 1 sip, maybe 2, and then she stopped, reset. I knew immediately it wasn't a cardiac event. The throat response was too specific. I've seen aconite poisoning in a case study. The alkaloid binds to sodium channels and causes exactly that kind of... You've seen it. In a food safety certification course, aconite appears in certain traditional preparations if the root isn't processed correctly. I cross-referenced it against every ingredient I used tonight, which is why I can tell you with complete certainty that it was not in his food." She held his gaze without blinking. "Someone got to that water glass, and it wasn't me, because I was in the kitchen." Chung-Ae leaned back in his chair. He looked at her for a long time. "You understand," he said, "that I cannot simply take your word for that." "I understand completely." She didn't look away. "Which is why I'd like to suggest we test the remaining food from tonight's dinner service and compare it against residue from the glass. The compounds won't lie, even if people do." He almost said something that wasn't an interrogation. He caught it before it reached his mouth. "You'll remain under guard," he said. "You won't go anywhere alone. You won't communicate with anyone outside this building, and you will continue treating my grandfather until I determine otherwise." Cheryl nodded once. That's fair. I don't care if it's fair, he said. It's what's happening. She stood up. At the door, she turned back, and there was something in her expression that had shifted. The terror was still there, deep underneath, but sitting above it now was something steadier, something almost like resolve. Whoever did this, she said, used a compound that requires precise measurement and intimate knowledge of his medical profile, his age, his kidney function, his existing medications. That's not opportunistic. That took weeks of planning. She paused. It's someone who had access to his medical records. Whoever you interrogate next, start there. She left. Chung-Ae sat in the silence of his study for exactly 45 seconds. Then he picked up his radio and started working through everyone else. By midnight, the kitchen had been transformed. Cheryl had asked for specific things in a specific order, and Chung-Ae had watched her make the list and had his men retrieve every item without comment. Sterile gauze, medical-grade tape, the first aid kit from the East Wing, a portable blood pressure cuff that the estate kept for the grandfather's regular nurse visits, 2 IV bags of saline from the medical storage room that Cheryl had been shown on her first day, clean linens from the linen cupboard, a specific type of carbon filtration pitcher for the grandfather's ongoing water intake, and, improbably, a jar of raw honey. The honey is a mucosal coating agent, she said, when one of the guards looked at it sideways. It lines the esophagus and helps with the burning. Traditional remedies aren't myths. Their chemistry nobody bothered to patent. They'd moved the grandfather with extreme care, Chung-Ae on one side, his most trusted Lieutenant Jin on the other, Cheryl guiding the transfer with quiet authority, telling them exactly where to put their hands and how to support the weight and how fast to move. They laid him on the long stainless prep table that Cheryl had covered in doubled layers of clean linen, and she had gone to work immediately, setting the IV line with a focus that did not waver, monitoring his pulse at 30-second intervals, adjusting the angle of his head to keep the airway open. 2 guards stood inside the kitchen at all times, 2 more outside the door. Chung-Ae stood in the corner with his arms crossed and watched her work, and he thought about what she'd said in the study. Weeks of planning, access to medical records, someone who knew the old man's chemistry as intimately as Cheryl claimed to know her poisons. He thought about the water glass. He hadn't touched it. He'd left it where it was, on the rug in the dining room, in the same position it had fallen. He'd had Jin photograph it from every angle before the room was sealed. The milky puddle had started to dry at the edges by then, leaving a faint tide mark on the antique fibers that would cost more to clean than most people earned in a year. Somewhere around 0 inches the morning, the grandfather's breathing changed. Not for the worse, but differently. Slower, more deliberate. The desperate, dragging quality of it began to soften into something that resembled, cautiously, sleep. Cheryl made a small sound. Not a word. Just an exhalation of something she'd been holding in her chest for hours. His pressure is stabilizing, she said. Her voice had gone quiet, careful, like she was delivering news in a church. The charcoal is working. He's processing the toxin out. Chung-Ae looked at his grandfather's face. The color was still not right, but it was closer to right than it had been, and that distance felt enormous. Will he wake up? He said. Yes. She said it without hesitation, and he found, to his own irritation, that he believed her. Probably in the next few hours. He'll be weak, he'll be disoriented, but he'll wake up. She pulled a stool over and sat down at the grandfather's bedside at the edge of the prep table and rested her hands in her lap and went back to counting the pulse at 30-second intervals. Watching, waiting. The kitchen hummed with the low industrial white noise of refrigeration units and ventilation, and the 2 guards who shifted their weight every few minutes in the silence. Chung-Ae did not leave. At 2:30 inches the morning, he went back to the dining room alone. The room was exactly as he'd left it sealed, untouched, lit by the low amber warmth of the wall sconces that nobody had thought to turn off. The dinner table still held the remnants of the evening. The half-cleared place setting, the folded linen napkin, the small arrangement of white chrysanthemums that his grandfather requested at every meal, because they had been his wife's favorite flower. The rug. The glass. Chung-Ae crouched down in front of it. He didn't pick it up. He looked at it the way you look at something when you're trying to understand not just what it is, but what it means, what it represents about the person who put it in motion. The glass was his grandfather's personal set. Lead crystal, hand-cut, kept in a specific cabinet in the dining room sideboard that nobody touched without permission. Irreplaceable. The old man drank water from those glasses and nothing else. Had done so for 30 years. Chung-Ae looked at the white residue on the rug around the spill. He looked at the glass itself, at the rim. There was something there. A faint, matte quality to the crystal at the top edge, almost imperceptible, something you would never see unless you were looking, and you would only look if you already knew what you were looking for. A slight unevenness in the light refraction along the upper half-inch of crystal. Not inside the glass. Not in the water. On the rim. He stood up and went back to the kitchen. Cheryl looked up when he entered. The grandfather was sleeping. The guards tracked Chung-Ae across the room with their eyes, and then went still again. "Come here," he said. She came. He walked her back to the dining room, told her to crouch where he had, told her to look at the rim of the glass the way he'd looked at it without touching it. She was quiet for a long time. "It was painted on," she said. "Explain." Aconite alkaloid in solution dissolved in something with a low evaporation rate, something clear, something that would dry matte on crystal and be invisible until it made contact with moisture. She stood up slowly. "You press your lips to that rim to drink. Saliva and water reconstitute the compound. It absorbs through the mucous membrane of the mouth and throat before it even reaches the stomach." She turned to look at him. "That's why the charcoal helped, but only partially. Some of it was already in his bloodstream through direct absorption, not gastric intake. Which means the food was never the delivery method. It was never the food." She said it quietly, and her eyes were doing something complicated. Someone with access to that glass. Someone who knew exactly which glass he uses. Someone who could apply a dissolved compound to a crystal rim and have it dry clear and have nobody notice. Chung-Ae looked at the glass. He looked at the cabinet where the set was kept, whose door was slightly ajar. "Someone on staff," he said. "Someone trusted," she said. Trusted enough to be alone in this room with his personal things. He thought about the staff. He thought about every person who moved through these rooms without his grandfather reacting. Without the old man's instincts sharpened over 6 decades of surviving a world that had tried to kill him, repeatedly registering as a threat. There was one person. The same person who had been pouring his grandfather's water for 23 years. "Where's the butler?" Chung-Ae said. His name was Park Sung-jin, and he had arrived at the estate the year Chung-Ae was 7 years old. Chung-Ae could remember him from childhood as a constant, a fixed point in the geography of his grandfather's world, quiet, precise, perfectly calibrated to the old man's preferences in the way that only decades of intimate service could produce. He knew how the patriarch took his tea, which chair he preferred in each season, how he liked the drapes positioned in the morning versus the evening. He was the daily grammar of his grandfather's life, present and fluent in every room. Chung-Ae had Jin check the butler's quarters first, then the staff common room, then the service corridor that ran behind the kitchen and the laundry. Jin came back in 9 minutes. One look at his face and Chung-Ae already knew. The butler's room was at the back of the staff quarters, a small room, neat as a military barracks, smelling of the same cedarwood polish he'd used on the grandfather's furniture for 2 decades. The window was closed. The lamp on the bedside table was on. Park Sung-jin was in the chair by the window. He was dressed in his full livery, which struck Chung-Ae first the formal uniform, the white gloves still on his hands, as if he'd sat down in his good clothes to wait for something. His head was tipped slightly to the right, and the expression on his face was not frightened. It wasn't anguished. It was the particular blankness of someone who had stopped in the middle of a thought. The small teacup on the table beside him was empty, rinsed clean. Chung-Ae stood in the doorway of the room for a long time without moving, without speaking, without letting any of the things moving through him reach his face. The butler hadn't acted alone. That much was immediately clear. Park Sung-jin was not a man with ambitions or enemies, or the particular breed of desperation that pushes a person to murder. He was a man who had served faithfully for 23 years, and someone had used that faithfulness the way you use a tool, told him, most likely, that the compound in the small vial was a new medication to be painted onto the rim for gradual absorption. A physician's instruction, nothing unusual for a man with the patriarch's complicated medical history. And when the tool was no longer needed, when the grandfather had failed to die on schedule and the lockdown had begun to close around everyone, that same someone had found another vial and another errand for the butler's faithful hands, except this time, the errand was his last. Chung-Ae calculated the timing. It had happened in the window before the lockdown fully sealed, in the 40 minutes between his first order and the moment every door had a body behind it. Someone who moved without being questioned. Someone with the authority of family. Whoever had done this was still here. Chung-Ae turned away from the room. Behind him, one of his men started to speak, and he held up one hand, a single flat gesture, and the man went silent. He walked back through the corridor, through the kitchen, past the guards, to the prep table where his grandfather was sleeping with something that was beginning to look, tentatively, like peace. Cheryl was sitting on her stool. She looked up when he came back, and whatever she read in his face made her own expression go very still. "The butler?" she said. "Dead." He said it the way he said most things, without the weight it deserved, because putting the weight in his voice never changed the facts of anything. Sitting in his chair. Whoever used him got to him before the lockdown completed and made sure he couldn't be questioned afterward. She absorbed this. She didn't look away. "Then someone on this estate moved freely in the window before you sealed it," she said slowly. "Someone with the authority to approach staff without raising suspicion. Someone the butler would have opened his door to without hesitation. Someone I would have let through myself," Chung-Ae said quietly, without thinking twice. The kitchen was quiet. The grandfather breathed. The refrigeration units hummed their cold, indifferent hum. Chung-Ae looked at the ceiling, at the industrial track lighting, at the rows of copper pots hanging above the central island that Cheryl had commandeered for her makeshift clinic. He thought about the glass with its painted rim. He thought about the butler in his formal uniform, sitting in his chair like a man who had been asked to wait and had waited, and been taken while he waited. He thought about the medical records Cheryl had mentioned, about weeks of planning, about intimate knowledge. He thought about who in his syndicate stood to gain the most from his grandfather's death. He thought about who had called him that evening to ask whether the patriarch was feeling well, an inquiry so precisely casual that he had not questioned it at the time. The thought arrived fully formed, the way the worst thoughts always do, not gradually, not with warning, but all at once, like a door slamming open onto a room you'd convinced yourself was empty. He looked at Cheryl. "I need you to stay in this kitchen," he said. "I need you to not leave this room for any reason. I need these men," he looked at the two guards, "to not let anyone in who doesn't come with me personally. Are we clear?" "We're clear," she said. "If anyone attempts to enter this kitchen without my authorization—" "I understand," she said. And then, quietly, with the kind of certainty that doesn't ask for anything in return, "I won't let anything happen to him." He looked at her, this woman he had held at gunpoint 4 hours ago. This stranger who had knelt on his grandfather's floor and refused to move, and refused to panic, and refused to be anything other than exactly what the moment required, and he felt something shift in the way he understood who in this world could be trusted. He did not say any of that. He said, "I'll be back." And then he went to find the person who had started all of this. Because the walls were sealed, the gates were locked, the phones were collected and the lines were cut, and every door had a body behind it. Whoever had poisoned his grandfather and murdered his butler was still inside this estate. And Nae Chung-Ae had never in his life needed anything other than time and walls to find out exactly who he was dealing with. Tonight, he had both. He moved through the corridor with the particular silence that men who control silence are capable of. No wasted motion, no noise, just intention moving through space like weather. Like the kind of thing you don't see coming until it's already standing in the room with you. Behind him, in the warm and humming kitchen, Cheryl Sletton put 2 fingers to the pulse point of the grandfather's wrist and counted, and watched the old man breathe, and waited. The estate held its breath around all of them, and somewhere, inside its sealed and guarded walls, the person who had painted poison on the rim of a crystal glass was beginning to understand that the silence had changed, that the thing controlling it now was not patience or procedure or the careful distance of a plan unfolding on schedule. It was fury, and it knew their name. He came back to the kitchen at 4, 0 inches the morning, with nothing to show for 2 hours of interrogation, except the particular hollowness that settles into a man when he realizes the answers he's looking for are not going to come from the mouths of frightened people. He had gone through every member of staff still awake. He had asked the same questions in different configurations, watching faces the way he had been trained to watch them, not for what they showed, but for what they worked to hide. He had found fear, which was expected. He had found confusion, which was genuine. He had found one of the kitchen assistants crying in the staff corridor, and 2 of the grounds guards who had been playing cards in the gatehouse all evening and had no knowledge of anything. What he had not found was the particular quality of stillness that people manufacture when they know more than they're saying, which meant whoever he was looking for was very good, or very calm, or both. He pushed open the kitchen door and stopped. Cheryl had not been idle. The grandfather was sleeping peacefully, the IV line still running, the blood pressure cuff on the table beside him, a clean linen pulled up to his chest with the kind of careful tucking that suggested it had been adjusted more than once. The guards were in their positions, but the central prep island, the part of it not occupied by the makeshift medical station, had been quietly transformed. A small pot sat on the back burner of the range, low heat, barely a simmer, 2 bowls, a plate with sliced scallions, and a small dish of sesame oil and a folded cloth napkin that she had pressed flat with her hands because there was no iron in the kitchen. She looked up when he entered. "I didn't know if you'd eaten," she said. It was not an apology and it was not an offering. It was a simple statement of fact from someone who noticed things and responded to them, the same way she had noticed an old man's breathing and responded to that. Chung-Ae looked at the bowls. He looked at the pot. He looked at the sleeping patriarch, chest rising and falling in the slow, reliable rhythm of a man who had, against significant odds, decided to keep living. He sat down on the stool across the island from her. She ladled the soup without ceremony, a clear broth, golden and clean-smelling, with thin sliced ginger, and what looked like hand-torn pieces of bread that she'd toasted in the oven and floated on top because there was no rice left in the quantity she would have preferred. She pushed the scallions and sesame oil toward him and sat down with her own bowl and picked up her spoon, and that was all. No performance. No attempt to make the gesture mean more than it was. He ate. It was, objectively, the best thing he had put in his body in longer than he could immediately calculate, which said something about either her skill or his deprivation or the particular way that food tastes when you have been surviving on adrenaline for 6 hours and the crisis has shifted, temporarily, from explosive to merely catastrophic. They ate in silence for a while. The kitchen hummed. The grandfather breathed. "You cooked for him every night this week," Chung-Ae said. It wasn't a question. Tuesday through Saturday. He gave his regular cook Sundays and Mondays. Said everyone deserved 2 days to remember they have a life outside of someone else's appetite. She turned the spoon in her bowl. He said it like it was a moral position, which, I suppose it was. He has opinions about most things. He has opinions about everything. He told me on Wednesday that the way a person seasons their food reveals their fundamental relationship with pleasure. She paused. He said most powerful men undersalt, because they've spent so long controlling everything around them that they forget to let themselves enjoy anything. Chung-Ae was quiet for a moment. "And what did you say to that?" I said he was probably right, and then I added more salt to his broth while he was watching, just to see what he'd do. A ghost of something moved across her face, not quite a smile, but the memory of one. He laughed. I hadn't heard him laugh before that. Chung-Ae looked at his bowl. He thought about his grandfather laughing in the company of this woman he had known for 3 weeks, and felt, at the edge of something he was not prepared to examine, a complicated mix of gratitude and grief. "How did you end up here?" he said. "In Seoul, cooking for a Korean crime patriarch." She was quiet for a moment, not the silence of someone deciding how much to reveal, but the silence of someone deciding where to start. "I had a restaurant," she said. "In Chicago. Small place, 40 seats, the kind of food that took 3 days to prepare for one night's service. I had a business partner who I trusted completely." She picked up her spoon again. "He ran the financial side. I ran the kitchen. It worked for 4 years, and then it didn't. Because he had been quietly siphoning money from the business for 2 of those years, and when it collapsed, he made sure the records showed it was my decisions that caused it." She said it evenly, not without feeling, but the feeling had been lived with long enough to stop being sharp. "I lost the restaurant. I lost my reputation in that city. I spent a year rebuilding from the outside in, taking private chef contracts wherever I could find them. Someone in a network I belonged to heard about this position. Discreet household, specialized diet requirements, significant compensation." She looked up at him. "I needed the distance as much as the work." Chung-Ae considered this. "You trusted someone and it destroyed you." "Yes. And you came here anyway, into a household where trust is a liability." "I came here to cook," she said simply. "I wasn't planning to be involved in anything else." "Nobody plans for any of this." She looked at him for a moment. "No, they don't." He turned his bowl in his hands. The soup was nearly gone. Outside the sealed kitchen, the estate was still and dark and full of people sleeping or pretending to sleep. And somewhere inside it, the person he was looking for was waiting for morning, the same way Chung-Ae was not with hope, but with calculation. "I run the syndicate the way I run it because my grandfather built it the way he built it," he said. He didn't say it as an explanation. He said it the way you say things at 4, 0 inches the morning to someone who has no stake in your life and therefore no reason to use what you tell them against you. Loyalty before everything. Blood before everything. The empire exists to protect the family, and the family gives the empire its meaning. He paused. "That is what I was taught. That is what I believed." She didn't fill the silence. She waited. "If it was someone in my family," he said, "then the thing I built my entire understanding of power on is not what I thought it was." Cheryl looked at him steadily. "The thing you built your understanding of power on is loyalty," she said. "Not blood. Those aren't the same thing. You just assumed they were because for a long time they happened to overlap." She paused. "Blood is an accident of biology. Loyalty is a choice someone makes every single day." She glanced at the sleeping patriarch. "He knows the difference. I think that's why he trusts very few people." Chung-Ae followed her gaze to his grandfather's sleeping face. "How did you know," he said quietly, "that the compound was aconite? Specifically, in the 10 seconds you had to assess before I walked in." She met his eyes. Because of the way he was holding his throat. Aconite causes a specific paresthesia, a burning, numbing sensation in the mouth and throat almost immediately on contact. The way he was clawing at himself, the specific position of his hands high up at the jawline, not the lower throat, like someone choking on food, and the fact that the glass was water clear before it spilled, not discolored, which ruled out most obvious compounds. She held his gaze. "I've studied food safety at a level that most people would find excessive. I've always believed that the person responsible for what goes into a human body should understand exactly what that body can and cannot survive." He looked at her for a long time. "I held a gun to your head," he said. "You did. And you still helped him." He needed help. She said it like it was the simplest equation in the world. What you were doing with the gun was understandable. It wasn't relevant to what he needed. Chung-Ae set down his bowl. There were things he did not say out loud in his life positions, assessments, recalibrations that happened in the interior of him and never reached his mouth. He made one of those now, in the silence of the kitchen, with the soup cooling in the bowls and his grandfather breathing steadily behind them, and the 2 guards standing at the door like they weren't listening to every word. He stood up. "Try to sleep," he said. "There's a cot in the supply room off the east wall. Stay in this kitchen." "I know," she said. "I mean it. Don't go anywhere in this building alone. Not for any reason." She looked at him with the expression she'd been developing across the course of the night, the one that was neither naive nor cynical but something more precise. A calibrated awareness of what kind of world she was currently inside. "Do you know who it is yet?" He looked at the door. "I have a strong suspicion," he said, "and I'm going to need it to become certainty before I move." He left the kitchen. Behind him, the sound of her clearing the bowls, quiet and methodical, followed him down the corridor like something he hadn't expected to be reluctant to leave. The uncle arrived at 7 in the morning. His name was Nae Chung-Ae, and he was the grandfather's only surviving son, which made him Chung-Ae's father's younger brother, which made him, in the formal landscape of the syndicate, the second-ranking member of the family by bloodline. He was 61 years old and looked 50, and carried himself with the particular ease of a man who had spent decades in the proximity of power without ever quite holding it, which had given him an exceptionally refined ability to appear generous. He came through the main gate at 7:04 a.m. in a black car, alone except for a driver, which was how Chung-Ae knew immediately that something was wrong. Byung-ho never went anywhere without at least 2 personal security men. It was a habit so deeply embedded, it was essentially structural. The fact that he had arrived without them did not mean he felt safe. It meant he did not want witnesses to his arrival, and it meant his men were already positioned somewhere nearby, staged and waiting for a signal that had not yet been given. He came through the front door with his arms already open, his face arranged in the specific expression of a man receiving terrible news he has been privately preparing for. "I heard," he said. "One of the perimeter staff called me before you could lock the phones down." "How is he? Where is he? Let me see him." "He's stable," Chung-Ae said. "He's being treated." "Treated where? Why haven't you moved him to a hospital?" "Because hospitals have staff I haven't vetted, and moving him poses risks I'm not prepared to take." Chung-Ae looked at his uncle with the flat, measuring gaze he normally reserved for business negotiations. "How did you get through the gate?" "I told them who I was. I gave specific orders that no one enters." Byung-ho spread his hands in a gesture of innocent bewilderment. "Chung-Ae, I am his son. You would have me wait outside my own father's gates while he is dying inside?" "He is not dying. I told you he's stable." "Then let me see him." "In a moment." Chung-Ae kept his voice level. "First, walk with me." He took his uncle through the west wing, away from the kitchen, and he asked him questions in the same patient configuration he had used on the staff. Where had he been last evening? When had he last spoken to the grandfather? What did he know about the patriarch's recent medical situation? Had he had any contact with the household staff in the past 2 weeks, outside of normal family interactions? Byung-ho answered every question smoothly. Too smoothly, not the smoothness of innocence, but the smoothness of preparation, the kind that comes from rehearsing answers before they're needed. He expressed grief in the right proportions, concern in the right quantities. He asked follow-up questions that demonstrated the precise amount of engagement a worried family member should demonstrate. He was, Chung-Ae thought, very good. But he was not perfect, because twice during the conversation, his eyes moved briefly, quickly, a flicker of directional attention that he couldn't quite control toward the east corridor, toward the kitchen. After 40 minutes, Chung-Ae allowed him to see the grandfather. He watched his uncle stand at the entrance to the kitchen and look at the old man sleeping on the prepared table. Then he watched Byung-ho's gaze move just once, controlled almost before it happened to Cheryl, standing at the IV stand on the far side of the table. Something crossed his uncle's face in that fraction of a second. Not surprise, not concern, but the swift recalibration of a man who had built a plan around this woman and was now watching that plan hold its shape against the wrong outcome. He smoothed it under grief before anyone else could have caught it. Chung-Ae caught it. "He looks terrible," Byung-ho said. "He looks alive," Chung-Ae said. Byung-ho put a hand over his heart. "Praise God." He turned away from the kitchen. "I'll stay, of course. Whatever you need." I can coordinate with the outer security teams, manage the communication to the other families. I have that handled. Chung-Ae. His uncle put a hand on his shoulder, a warm, paternal gesture that Chung-Ae had grown up receiving and had always taken at face value. You've been awake all night. Let me take some of the burden. That is what family is for. Chung-Ae looked at the hand on his shoulder. I know, he said. Go and rest in the east guest room. I'll come find you when I need you. His uncle nodded and went. Chung-Ae waited a deliberate moment and then sent Jin to watch him. He didn't need Jin's report to know what his uncle would do next. He already knew. He had known the moment he saw the direction of those two eye movements in the West Wing corridor, the way Byung-ho's attention had snagged on the East corridor, not with curiosity, but with purpose. But he let it happen, because he needed the certainty. Cheryl was in the kitchen supply room when Jin came to find him at 8:30 a.m. She had slept, briefly, on the cot maybe 2 hours, enough to take the sharpest edge off the exhaustion. She was awake now and back at the patriarch's side, adjusting the IV drip with the focused attention of someone who had adopted a patient and intended to see it through. Your uncle went to her quarters, Jin said quietly. He had his phone out, the one phone Chung-Ae had kept, his own encrypted device. 22 minutes. I have footage. Chung-Ae looked at the footage. The guest room that Cheryl had been assigned on her first day was on the 3rd floor of the East Wing. A comfortable room, nothing elaborate, with a single window overlooking the back garden. His uncle went in alone, moving quickly and quietly in a way that was at odds with the unhurried grief he had performed downstairs. He went directly to the wardrobe, to the shelf above the hanging rail, and he placed something there, a small object, moving fast, tucking it behind the folded items already present. Then he went to the writing desk by the window and opened the small drawer and placed something there as well. Then he left. The whole thing took less than 4 minutes. Chung-Ae watched it twice. Then he went to Cheryl's room himself, with Jin, and he went to the wardrobe shelf first, behind a folded sweater, in a small cloth bag, a glass vial, sealed, containing a pale liquid. He did not open it. He photographed it and left it in place. Then the desk drawer. A folded piece of paper, handwritten, in Korean a receipt, or something designed to look like a receipt, something that would suggest a transaction, a purchase, a payment. Someone paying a foreign chef to poison a Korean patriarch. He photographed that too, and left it exactly as it had been placed. Clean. Simple. The kind of fabricated evidence that, in the right hands, could end a trial before it started and justify an execution before morning. He stood in the middle of Cheryl's room and felt the cold clarity of understanding settle over everything like a change in temperature. His uncle had not acted impulsively. This was not a crime of opportunity or desperation. This was a construction built carefully, over time, with the patience of someone who understood that the best betrayals are the ones that carry their own pre-packaged explanations. Cheryl had been chosen not just as a tool, but as a narrative. A foreign black woman, new to the household, unknown, unconnected, the perfect scapegoat for an assassination that would transfer power from a recovering patriarch to an ambitious son. The only thing that had gone wrong was that the patriarch had survived, and that the scapegoat had turned out to be the only person in the building capable of keeping him alive. He left the room and went back to the kitchen, and he told Cheryl, precisely and without softening it, what he had found, and confirmed that he had the footage, the photographs, and Jin as a witness. She listened. She didn't look surprised. She looked the way people look when something they already suspected is confirmed, not vindicated, just resolved. So what happens now? She said. Now I wait for him to make his next move, Chung-Ae said. Because the planted evidence only works if my grandfather doesn't survive to contradict it. Since my grandfather is surviving, he looked at the sleeping patriarch. Byung-ho has a problem, and people with problems make decisions. And when he makes his decision, then I'll be ready for it. He looked at her steadily. In the meantime, he said, I need you to understand that the evidence in your room is still in place. To anyone who came in right now without context, you would look guilty. That is not an accident. and it is not a small thing. He paused. I want you to know that I know it isn't yours. And I want you to know that the footage and photographs make that case completely. Cheryl looked at him for a moment that held more weight than most conversations, 3 times its length. Thank you, she said, quietly, simply. He nodded once and went back to waiting. The grandfather opened his eyes at 11, 0 inches the morning. Not suddenly, not the dramatic resurgence of a man reclaiming himself all at once. It was gradual, the way recovery is always gradual when it's real. A small movement of the eyelids, a shift in the quality of the stillness, a slow return of presence to a face that had been absent for hours. Cheryl saw it first. She put 2 fingers to his wrist, confirming the pulse change, and then leaned slightly toward him and said, in a voice calibrated precisely to reach him without startling him, "You're in the kitchen. You're safe. Your grandson is here." The old man's eyes opened fully. They were clear, not the clouded, confused eyes of someone returning from fever or deep sedation, but the specific clarity of someone who knows exactly where they are and has been waiting to get there. He looked at Cheryl, and he said, in Korean first, something that she didn't understand, and then, because he had taken the trouble to learn that she spoke English and had spoken it with her every evening over tea in English. "You stayed." "I stayed," she said. He was quiet for a moment. His hands moved slightly, not reaching, just testing, confirming the information of his own body. She let him take stock. She checked his pupils, his pressure, the rate and depth of his breathing. Everything was moving in the right direction. "How bad?" he said. "Bad enough. You're going to feel weak for several days. There may be some residual numbness in your lips and fingertips. Your kidney function will need monitoring." She paused. "But you're going to be okay." He looked at her for a long moment. There was something in his eyes, not gratitude, exactly, though gratitude was present. Something older than that. Something that had been waiting for the right moment to be said. "I need to tell you something," he said, "before my grandson comes back, before anyone else is in this room." Cheryl looked at the 2 guards by the door. "Step outside for 2 minutes," she said. They looked at each other. She held their gaze. 2 minutes. They went. She leaned close to the patriarch. He spoke quietly, his voice thin from the ordeal but precise, chosen with the careful economy of a man who had spent 60 years saying exactly what needed to be said and nothing more. "I knew," he said. She went very still. "I had suspicions for 3 months, the kind that begin as instincts and slowly become certainties, about Byung-ho, about his intentions." His eyes held hers, steady and unflinching. "I had people watching. I gathered what I could. But suspicion without evidence is nothing in this world. It is a weapon without a trigger. And Byung-ho is careful. He has always been careful." He stopped to breathe a longer breath, managing the effort of speech. "I needed him to act. I needed him to commit himself to something irrevocable. Something that could not be undone or denied." Cheryl understood what was coming before he said it. She could feel it the way you feel the structure of a story shifting into its final configuration. "The glass," she said. "I saw it," he said simply. "I saw what had been done to it. I am old and I am cautious and I inspect things that will touch my mouth. I have done so for 30 years, because in my world, being alive at my age is not an accident." He looked at her. "I knew what was on the rim. I knew what it would do. I knew that if I did not drink it, Byung-ho would find another method, one I might not detect, at a moment I might not choose, with no one present who could intervene." He paused again. "And I knew you were here." "You drank it," she said, deliberately, "because you knew I would try to help you. Because I knew what you could do," he said. "I had been watching you for 3 weeks. Not just as a chef. I watch everyone who enters my home. It is a habit that has kept me alive. I knew your background, your education, the precision of your knowledge." He held her gaze with the full weight of what he was saying. "I gambled my life on the belief that you were exactly who I believed you to be. And on the belief that Chung-Ae, for all his fury and his faults, would not pull the trigger before he understood the situation. Cheryl sat back slightly. She was quiet for a long moment. "That is," she said carefully, "the most terrifying and most extraordinary thing anyone has ever told me." Something moved across the old man's face that was, unmistakably, the beginning of a smile. "I have lived a terrifying and extraordinary life," he said. It seemed fitting. The almost smile faded into something more serious. "Tell him," he said. "Tell Chung-Ae. He needs to know that Byung-ho committed himself fully last night, that the evidence exists, that the path forward is clear." He reached out and put one thin, trembling hand over hers. "And tell him." He stopped. Something passed through his face that was, for just a moment, not the patriarch, not the retired boss, not the man who had survived 6 decades of this world, but simply a father who had outlived his son and raised the grandson in his place. Tell him that the rot in this family did not come from his father, that his father was a good man, that the poison, the real poison, not what was on that glass, belonged only to Byung-ho, and it will leave with him. Cheryl looked at this old man's hand over hers. The white gloves were gone, and his fingers were cold still from the night's ordeal. And his grip was fragile but deliberate, and she felt something in her chest that she would not have words for until much later, when she had the distance to examine it. "I'll tell him," she said. She called the guards back in. She went to find Chung-Ae. She found him in the west corridor, coming toward the kitchen with Jin beside him and a look on his face that she had not seen before, not the compressed fury of the previous night, not the controlled assessment of the interrogations, but something urgent, crackling, the look of a man who has just received information that has accelerated a timeline he was not quite ready for. "He's awake," she said. "He needs to see you. But first..." "Byung-ho's security team just arrived at the outer gate," Chung-Ae said. 6 men. Vehicles. "They're being held outside, but they won't be held long." His eyes were sharp. "He pre-staged them before he came in alone this morning. He's giving the signal." "Then there's something you need to know first," she said. "Right now. Before anything else happens." She told him. She told him everything the grandfather had said quickly, precisely, with no editorial, the way she had processed the information and held it during the walk from the kitchen, understanding that the manner of delivery mattered as much as the content, when the content was this particular configuration of sacrifice and love and terrible strategic genius. Chung-Ae listened without moving, without speaking, without any of the micro-expressions that normally gave her some purchase on what he was processing. When she finished, the corridor was very quiet. Jin was looking at the floor. Chung-Ae looked straight ahead, at a fixed point in the middle distance, and his jaw was tight, and something was happening in his eyes that was not fury and was not grief, but occupied the territory where those two things meet. Then he said, very quietly, "He drank it on purpose." "Yes." "He trusted you to save him." "Yes." He was silent for another moment. "Go back to the kitchen," he said. "Stay with him. Lock the door this time, there's a bolt on the inside. Throw it and don't open it for anyone who is not me. Do you understand?" "Yes," she said. He looked at her, a direct, full look, the kind he had not given her until this moment. It lasted 2 seconds at most. "Thank you," he said. It came out with the careful precision of a man placing something fragile on a surface and making sure it lands correctly. Then he turned to Jin and said something in Korean, and they moved, both of them, with speed. Cheryl went back to the kitchen and threw the bolt. She heard it before she understood it. At first it was distant sounds from the West Wing that could have been anything, the building settling, a door opening too hard, voices raised in the particular rhythm of confrontation. The grandfather was awake and watching her face with the calm attention of a man who had spent his life reading rooms through other people's reactions. "It has started," he said. "Don't sit up," she said. Then it was closer. Boots in the service corridor, not the measured patrol of the estate guards, but the double-time, purposeful movement of people with a destination and the intention to reach it quickly. She heard shouting Korean, quick and sharp, and then a sound that was unmistakably the answer to a question she'd been hoping wouldn't need to be asked. Gunfire. 2 shots, distant, from the east wing. The 2 kitchen guards moved toward the door simultaneously. "Don't open it," Cheryl said. "Our orders. Your orders are to stay in this room." She was already moving, not toward the door but away from it, toward the kitchen itself, toward the prep stations and the range and the industrial storage. Her mind had gone to a place she had never needed to access before but had always known was there, the part of her that understood environments, that read a room not for its aesthetics but for its physics, its chemistry, its potential. "Both of you get him behind the island, right now. Move him gently, but move him." They moved 1 guard supporting the grandfather, IV stand rolling alongside, both of them positioning behind the heavy stainless steel of the central prep island. Despite everything, the night, the poison, the hours on a prep table, the old man kept his eyes open the whole way. He settled against the cabinet with the deliberate stillness of a man conserving what he had, his face pale and drawn, thinner than he should have been, but watching, still watching. The bolt on the door held. For 30 seconds, it held. Then it didn't. The door came in fast, not kicked but forced with the specific mechanical efficiency of people who had done this before a wedge device applied to the frame, the bolt hardware tearing through the wood on the second application of force. And then 4 men in dark tactical gear were inside the kitchen, and the 2 estate guards were raising weapons, and there were 2 more shots, and then one of the estate guards went down with a wound to his shoulder, while the other took position behind the refrigeration unit, trading fire with the breach team from cover. Cheryl was at the range before any of them oriented fully on her. She had the burner on high before the second man found his footing. The largest stockpot in the kitchen, 20 quart, commercial grade, half filled with the water she had been keeping heated for the ongoing treatment, came off the range in a single motion and went toward the nearest man before he had fully raised his weapon. The water was just below boiling. The sound he made was not something she wanted to think about later. He went down and his weapon clattered, and the second man swung toward her, and she was already moving behind the central island, staying low, the copper hanging rack above her head swaying from the disruption. The third man had oriented on the grandfather. She grabbed a cast-iron pan from the lower rack, 14 inches, seasoned and heavy, the kind of weight that communicates itself differently than manufactured weapons because it does not apologize for itself. And she came up from behind the island, and she hit him before he could take 2 steps toward the old man. The sound it made was dense and irreversible. He dropped. The 4th man had a line on her. She threw the pan. Not at him, at the hanging rack above him, because the angle was wrong and she was not going to make that mistake. But the rack came down with 6 copper pots and a full cascade of hanging utensils, and it gave her 2 seconds she used to get the island between them, and her hand closed on the carving block at the prep station and pulled the longest knife and held it in the grip she had learned from the butcher in Lyon, who had taught her to break down a whole lamb and said that the grip mattered more than the blade. The man with the gun looked at her over the barrel. And then the kitchen door, not the service entrance but the main door, the one that opened from the west corridor, came off its hinges. Not forced, not wedged, hit. Chung-Ae came through it, moving at a speed that the room was not built to contain, and behind him Jin, and behind Jin 2 more of the estate's inner security team, and what happened next was fast and brutal, and without any wasted motion, the way things are when the person executing them has been waiting all night for permission to stop being patient. It lasted 40 seconds. When it was over, the kitchen was destroyed in the specific way that kitchens are destroyed when they are used as battlegrounds. The floor, a ruin of water and shattered crockery, and the collapsed hanging rack, one of the burners still going, the stockpot lying on its side draining the last of its contents across the tiles. While 2 of Chung-Ae's men began clearing the worst of the wreckage away from the area where the grandfather was positioned, Jin moved immediately to the downed estate guard, confirming the shoulder wound was non-fatal, applying pressure and calling for medical over his radio in the same breath. 3 of the 4 breach team were down. The 4th had surrendered. Chung-Ae was standing in the middle of the kitchen. He looked at Cheryl. She was still holding the knife. She realized this and set it down on the prep station and took her first full breath in what felt like several minutes. He crossed the kitchen in 4 strides, and he did something she did not expect, which was to put one hand on the side of her face, not gently, not romantically, but with the direct and deliberate pressure of someone confirming that something real is real and present and intact, and look at her with an intensity that had nothing behind it except the pure, unadorned fact of relief. "Are you hurt?" he said. "No," she said. He looked at her for one more second. Then he looked past her at his grandfather, who was behind the island where the guards had positioned him, sitting against the cabinet, pale, older than yesterday, the IV line still running from his arm but watching everything with eyes that had not dimmed. Their gaze met grandson and patriarch, and something passed between them that Cheryl understood was not something she was meant to interpret, that it belonged entirely to the two of them. The private language of a bond built across a lifetime of love and violence and survival, and that whatever it contained was being settled now in the space of a single glance. Then a voice from the doorway. Byung-ho. He had come with his men, but he had not come with them. He had stayed back, the way architects of violence always stay back, keeping distance between himself and the consequences of his plans. He stood in the ruined doorway of the kitchen, and he looked at the scene in front of him, and his face went through the same rapid calculation Chung-Ae had watched it perform that morning. But this time the calculation did not resolve into composure. This time it resolved into something rawer and less managed. "Chung-Ae," he said. "These men, I don't know who sent them. I came as soon as I heard." "Stop," Chung-Ae said. The single word landed in the kitchen like a dropped weight. Byung-ho stopped. Chung-Ae turned to face his uncle fully. He was not performing anger. He was not performing anything. He had moved past performance into the territory on the other side of it, where things become simply and entirely what they are. "You painted the poison on his glass yourself," Chung-Ae said. "You gave the compound to the butler and told him it was a medication for the patriarch's water, something to be applied to the rim, nothing unusual, a physician's instruction. And then you reached him before the lockdown completed and made sure the only thread leading to you was gone." His voice remained level. Controlled in the way that things are controlled when the control itself is a kind of sentence being delivered. "You put fabricated evidence in the chef's room to ensure her execution would close the investigation before it opened. And when my grandfather survived anyway. You pre-staged 6 men outside this estate before you walked through those gates alone this morning, so that when the time came, no one could trace the order back to you." He paused. "I have footage of what you put in her room. I have the timeline of the butler's last hour. I have his word, the word of the man who is still alive because of her." He looked at his uncle without blinking. "Do you want to tell me which part of that is incorrect?" Byung-ho was very still. "He built this empire," Byung-ho said. And his voice had dropped the performance too. What was underneath it was not grief and not guilt, but the particular ugliness of a man who has convinced himself that wanting something long enough makes him entitled to it. "He gave it to you, a grandson, not his son, not me. I have given 40 years to this family." "You gave 40 years to your own ambition," Chung-Ae said, "and you used this family as the vehicle for it." He looked at his uncle with an expression that Cheryl would remember for a long time, not hatred, which would have been almost easier to witness, but the specific disappointment of someone who has found the truth they were afraid of and has decided to face it anyway. "You are his son. And you tried to kill him. Whatever corruption lives in you, it belongs to you alone. It did not come from him, and it will not outlast this room." The silence in the kitchen was absolute. "Take him," Chung-Ae said to Jin. He did not watch them do it. He turned away and went to his grandfather. The estate spent the rest of that day in a different kind of silence, not the held-breath silence of the night before, but the silence of aftermath, of a storm that has finished and left the landscape rearranged. The record was intact footage, photographs, witnesses. Byung-ho's fabrication had no ground left to stand on, and the planted evidence from Cheryl's room was collected by Jin within the hour, photographed in situ, bagged, removed alongside everything else Byung-ho had brought into the estate that morning. Cheryl's name was clean. Chung-Ae made sure she knew it before the afternoon was over. The grandfather was moved to a proper bedroom in the late afternoon when Cheryl confirmed that his vitals were stable enough for the transfer. She supervised everything herself, and when the move was complete and he was settled in his own bed with proper pillows and the white chrysanthemums from the dining room placed on the side table where he could see them, he held her hand for a moment and said, "You are remarkable," in a tone that did not invite argument. "You're stubborn," she told him, which helped. "In my experience," he said, "those two things go well together." She laughed. She hadn't expected to, and it surprised her, and he watched it with the expression of a man who takes satisfaction in the things he predicted correctly. She found Chung-Ae at midnight. He was in the dining room, the same room where all of this had begun, which had been cleaned now, the rug taken up and removed, the crystal glass collected and sealed by Jin earlier in the day. The table was bare. The wall sconces were on their low setting, the same amber warmth from the night before, and Chung-Ae was standing at the window that looked out over the garden, his hands in his trouser pockets, his white shirt still unbuttoned, the dark ink of his tattoos visible in the dim light. He heard her come in. "How is he?" he said without turning. "Stronger than he should be, given what he put himself through." She came to stand a few feet from him. "He told me to tell you the rot in this family did not come from your father, that it belonged only to Byung-ho and it leaves with him." She paused. "And he said the good in this family is not extinct, that it's in you." She let that settle. "I believe that's an exact quote on both counts." Chung-Ae was quiet for a moment. She saw something move through his profile, something he controlled before it completed itself, which was, she was beginning to understand, simply how he processed things that mattered to him most. The things he didn't perform, because they were too real for performance. "He also told me," she said, "that he watched me for 3 weeks before he made his decision, that he knew what I could do." She looked at the bare table. "I've been thinking about what it means that he trusted a stranger more than his own son, what it says about what loyalty actually is." "It says that loyalty is built," Chung-Ae said, "not inherited." "Yes." She looked at him. "That's exactly what it says." He turned from the window. In the light of the room, in this space where everything had started and nearly ended, he looked not diminished, exactly. Because that was not a word that applied to him in any configuration but rearranged. Like someone who has been through something that has shifted what they understand about themselves, and has decided to let the new understanding stand rather than rebuild the old walls around it. "I have a proposal," he said. She waited. "I am going to offer you 2 things," he said, "and I want you to understand that both of them are genuine, that neither is a performance, and that whatever you choose I will respect without complication." He held her gaze directly. "The first is this: a car to the airport, first-class passage to wherever you want to go, and a bank transfer that will allow you to rebuild your restaurant twice over, in any city, with enough operating capital to never need to worry about a partner stealing from you again." He paused. "Full documentation clearing your name for use with any authorities you choose to contact. A letter of reference that will open any door in any culinary institution in the world, and my word that no one from my world will ever come anywhere near yours again." Cheryl looked at him. "And the second?" she said. "The second is a place here." He said it without elaboration at first, letting the plainness of it stand. "My grandfather needs a permanent private medical chef, someone who understands his dietary requirements and his health the way you've come to understand them in 3 weeks, and who has demonstrated they can manage a crisis that most trained medical professionals couldn't have handled. That position comes with quarters on the estate, a salary I will name in whatever figure makes the first option seem insufficient, and the protection of this house and everyone in it." He was quiet for a moment. "And it comes with a place, in this world, not outside it looking in, not as staff or employee or outside contractor, but as someone who is considered part of what this house protects." The dining room was very quiet. "You should understand," Cheryl said carefully. That I'm aware of what your world is, what it involves, what the cost of proximity to it is. Yes, he said. I'm aware that you're aware of that. And you're still making the offer. I'm making it because you came into this house and you held the line when there was no reason for you to hold it, except that it was the right thing to do, he said. And because my grandfather trusted you with something he trusted no one else with, and I have learned this week, in a more direct way than I would have preferred, that his instincts about people are not something I should second guess. He held her gaze. And because this house needs someone in it who does what you did last night, who uses what they know to protect instead of harm, who stays when they could run. Cheryl looked at this man, this volatile, contained, dangerous, unexpectedly precise man who had held a gun to her head the night before and shared a bowl of soup with her at 4:00 inches the morning, and pressed his hand to her face in the ruins of a kitchen to confirm she was intact. And she thought about Chicago, and the restaurant she had built and lost, and the year she had spent reassembling herself from the outside in, taking contracts in places she had no connection to, keeping the distance between herself and anything that resembled investment or permanence. She thought about an old man who had pressed his lips to a poisoned glass because he believed in her. She thought about what loyalty actually was, what it cost, what it returned. I need one condition, she said. Chung-Ae waited. The kitchen is mine, she said. Entirely. No one overrides my decisions in that space. No one enters without my knowledge, and what I serve in this house meets my standards, regardless of any other consideration. She held his gaze. That's non-negotiable. Something moved across Chung-Ae's face that she would later identify, when she had more practice reading it, as the expression he made when he was satisfied, not happy, exactly, which was a state that seemed to exist in him at a careful remove from the surface, but satisfied, the way a foundation settles when the last beam is placed and holds. The kitchen is yours, he said. She nodded once. He extended his hand. She looked at it for a moment, this hand that had held a weapon against her, that had hauled her by the collar through a corridor, that had pressed against her face in the ruins of a kitchen to confirm she was intact. And she thought that a handshake was an unusual way to formalize something that was not quite a business arrangement and not quite anything else. She had a word for yet. She shook it. His grip was firm and brief, and entirely serious. You should sleep, he said, properly, in an actual room. So should you, she said. He almost said something. She watched him decide against it and find a smaller thing to say instead. Tomorrow, he said, my grandfather will want congee, with exactly the right amount of salt. I know how he takes it, she said. She left the dining room first. Behind her, she heard nothing, no footsteps, no movement, which meant he stayed at the window, in the amber-lit room where everything had started, standing in the silence the way he had always controlled it. Except that the silence was different now, less like armor, more like space, the kind you leave on purpose for things that are still arriving. Subscribe and turn on notifications because the next chapter does not wait, and you do not want to walk into it without context. Drop a comment below and tell me where in the world you are watching from. I want to say hello to every single one of you because the further this story travels, the more that matters to me. And before you go, one question worth sitting with. The grandfather gambled his life on the belief that loyalty could exist outside of blood. Was he right? Or did Cheryl Sletton just survive the easiest night she will ever spend inside those walls? The next chapter is coming. And trust me, the silence it brings is a different kind entirely.